Widely published. My favorite of his works is a book called Every Nation for Himself, and I would recommend it to you. Life in a G0 World. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, appears frequently on NPR, Fox, CNBC. You'll enjoy him very much. Oscar Wilde once said, "If you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you." Well, Ian will tell us the truth, and he'll make us laugh. So it's with great pleasure I welcome my friend Ian Bremmer.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back here. I had not planned a joke to open the presentation. Apparently that was a mistake. I guess I can start by saying I know that you had Mike Froman here earlier on, so everything is getting better, right? That's important. It's good that we start with that. I run Eurasia Group, which is the world's largest geopolitical risk and consulting firm. I will tell you, I say that not in terms of trying to boast, but in the last week, I have an interesting metric, which is I look at all of my analysts and I see how many of them are on 24/7 watching their issues or countries in crisis mode. And it's about 40% of the platform. That's absolutely the most intense week in terms of volatility and conflict that we've had since the 2008 financial crisis. This is a very interesting week from a political risk perspective. I mean, you know, we of course are in U.S. electoral season. We just had the announcement of QE3, which will go very well until we see the next jobs report. We, of course, have lots and lots of movement on the Eurozone. You had a pretty good outcome in Dutch elections last week. You had a good outcome from the German Constitutional Court last week. You've got worse outcomes from the Portuguese coalition this week, which is starting to look like it's fraying and maybe towards its last legs. You, of course, have literally everything in movement in the Middle East, largely in a negative direction. And then we had Xi Jinping, who was not with us for 2 weeks, and returns, going to be the president of China, to coordinate anti-Japanese demonstrations across the country, and of course the closing of lots of Japanese businesses and impact on trade between those two countries. The Chinese always say, you know, you are blessed to be living in interesting times. We are particularly blessed this week. It's a very interesting time. I've been asked today to talk about a little bit about winners and losers in a G0 world. I want to give you a couple of minutes of that. And then I want to draw some implications for what it means with some of the markets we're looking at today. So to start, I was just talking to Sam DiPiazza, an old friend and colleague. We've worked together for almost a decade now. I'm delighted that he's chairing the organization now. I think you're really privileged to have him. I'm sure you agree. And he said that he was recently at the conference board and he was going around the table and everyone was asking there, you know, what are the things that concern them, and as they're talking about it, point after point after point, each reflects a big geopolitical concern. Each reflects actions that are out of their hands and in the hands of governments and aren't necessarily taken with economic outcomes first in mind. The state has returned. Geopolitics have returned. When I say a G0 world, what I mean is that we are living in a world with an absence of global leadership. The United States used to be the leader of global organizations. Going forward, we will either have the U.S. leading organizations that aren't global, or we'll have global organizations that aren't led, or we'll have neither. Right? Those are your options. We see this in trade. It's very obvious. We're not moving towards Doha anymore. Instead, we're developing a TPP. What's that? It's a coalition of the willing. but instead of on Afghanistan, it's on trade. A smaller group of like-minded nations to get together and find deeper integration, trade, capital flows, and the rest. Is China invited? No. Why not? Because they don't agree on a lot of stuff, right? That's the way trade is moving. It creates more conflict, but it's better than no agreement at all. Now on climate, we're not doing that yet. I teach at Columbia. I was at my first class last week, and I asked my students there, I said, you know, we've had Copenhagen, we've had Cancun, we've had Durban, we've had Rio +20. How many more failed global climate summits must we have before we realize we should stop having failed global climate summits? Right? And one of my students raised his hand, and he said 7. Struck me as a reasonable answer. It's probably more than 2 or 3. It probably isn't quite 10. I thought 7 was okay. Try it out. The point is, we don't have this leadership. I want to tell you why it is we don't have this leadership, because it'll make it obvious why it's not coming anytime soon. There are really 4 reasons. There are 4 very simple reasons. 1, too many countries, hard to coordinate. And it's not just the too many countries that say no. Right? On Syria, it's one thing if the Russians say no. Then you understand, well, if you want to do something on Syria, you're acting against the Russians. It's much harder when half of the countries around the table say, let's discuss modalities. We're worried about Syria, but you know, there are trade issues, and should we really move it in the United Nations, and let's talk about this in a month, and we've got an election, and this is hard for this act. Then you can't do anything. And that is, of course, precisely what we see on all of the big global challenges that we are trying to address in this environment. That's number 1. Number 2, Fareed Zakaria. You all know Fareed Zakaria. He wrote the book, The Post-American World, and he talks about this idea, the rise of the rest. And that's what globalization was all about. The US, Europe, and Japan, and now, the rise of the rest. Global emerging markets, more than 50% of the world's growth today, they come and join the advanced industrial democracies, and together we have truly global globalization. Only one problem, it's not the rise of the rest. It's the rise of the different. They are different. Doesn't make them bad, but we don't like different. We want them to be like us. That's why Bob Zoellick talks about responsible stakeholders. China, you should be responsible stakeholders. China says, well, wait a second. You want us to act like a rich country, though we're poor, and you want us to accept rules and norms that were created by you to benefit advanced industrial democracies. Yes, that's not going to work for us. That's fairly clear. The rise of the different. Poor countries with different priorities, with different political systems, different economic systems, many cases different values. We just had all these anti-American demonstrations. They are continuing across the Muslim world. And the response from Hillary Clinton and from Obama was these attacks are senseless, which is true and understandable from a Western perspective. If, on the other hand, support freedom of speech, these are odious videos and cartoons and magazines that come out, but you don't kill people as a consequence. From the perspective of many in the Arabic world, in the Islamic world, first of all, they believe that if a video comes out in the United States, that is because the American government is happy for it to come out. That is the actual view. That is the way it worked under Mubarak in Egypt, right? Why would it be different from the United States? And given the extraordinary importance placed against blasphemy of Muhammad, clearly this is something the United States government supports. We have to deal with that. I'm not saying it's a better value. I'm not saying it's a right value. But we have to understand it exists. To say it's senseless implies that no rational human being could possibly understand the sense of it. That, I assure all of you, is not true across the Islamic world, where we're invested. That's a problem. But it's a much bigger problem between the West and China. And so the differences in these values with the largest economy in the world, the US, and the economy that will be the largest economy in the world, the Chinese, fundamentally problematic. I can simplify global political risk for you very easily, right? The number one economy is an ally of the number 3 economy. The number 2 economy and the number 3 economy really fundamentally loathe each other. And the number 2 economy is going to become the number 1 economy. Is there any environment where that is not deeply problematic? It's much more problematic than anything in the Middle East. The rise of the different, right? Another point about the different is that even if they wanted to help, even if they wanted to provide global leadership, they don't have the capacity. Let me give you an interesting data point. India has 1.1 billion people. New Zealand has 4 million people. But New Zealand has more diplomats than India. Now, when we talk about New Zealand, we don't think they have the capacity to meaningfully help on global trade issues or sit around the table on the next financial crisis because they're tiny, right? But we expect this from India because they're big. They don't have the capacity. China's multinational corporations, most of them aren't multinational. If they are, they haven't been multinational for long. How much humanitarian capacity do the Russians have? I'm not saying as people, though that is an interesting question. I'm actually asking as a country, institutionally, right? And the answer is they don't. We don't do this stuff perfectly. And it's taken us decades, in some cases centuries, to start to get it right. But we expect that these emerging markets are suddenly, they've got big economies, so they can do it. They cannot. Third reason, the United States is less willing to provide this leadership. Fewer Americans believe that we benefit from being the world's policeman. Fewer Americans believe that we benefit from being the lender of last resort, to the Europeans, for example, or lead globalization, especially as the gap between rich and poor grows in this country. And if that is true in the United States, right, if that is true in the United States, it is even more true, fourth reason, of our European and Japanese allies. The Europeans who have had no time to think of or deal with anything over the course of the past couple of years but the Eurozone crisis. The Japanese who are just getting out of the worst year they have experienced since Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That is the fundamental challenge. Any one of those 4 reasons would have been enough to make you wonder if the US-led system of globalization would persist. We have all 4 simultaneously. This is not a disaster, but it's a radically different environment. In fact, one of the folks that benefit most greatly from this environment is the United States. The US equity market, US treasuries. Why? Because global volatility will continue to structurally increase, which means the US looks like more of a safe haven in 6 months or 1 year time than it did 5 years ago. That gives the United States the ability to engage in QE3. Sadly, it also gives the United States the ability to continue to ignore fundamental deficit issues for many years. It's what I call the safe haven curse. You've heard of the oil curse, right? I mean, countries that have oil don't need to do political and economic reform because they can take money out of the ground. The only thing easier than taking money out of the ground is taking money out of other countries' pockets, right? And that is precisely the situation that the United States is presently in. We go around the world and look at some of the other issues. The Eurozone crisis right now, I'm not fundamentally negative in the sense that I do not believe that the Eurozone is going to collapse. I do not believe that we're going to see fragmentation. I think that in 2 years' time it will be more clear that we're moving towards fiscal union. It'll be more clear that we are moving towards a unified banking supervisory system. It will not be all countries and all banks treated equally. The countries in the periphery that have received bailouts will have less sovereignty than the countries in the core. Now, what I find kind of interesting about that is that being fundamentally bullish that the Europeans will ultimately resolve the economic imbalances inherent in the Eurozone structure, monetary union but no fiscal union, will actually create bigger political problems. Because the sovereignty of so many of these Eurozone governments is being eroded. It will be eroded from the top down as you see more effective integration. It will also be eroded from the bottom up. Incumbents just get voted out regularly, and the legitimacy of these institutions are eroded because of the continued austerity and lack of growth. Furthermore, it's not just center-right to center-left like in France, but it's also the growth of fringe parties that attack the fundamental democratic legitimacy of many of these governments. It's Syriza in Greece. It's the Five-Star Movement in Italy. It's the National Front in France. Those will grow. But fundamentally, if you ask me, is the Eurozone going to stay intact? The answer is yes. Will there be Greek exit? If there is, it'll only be after it no longer matters for that first question. Do we need to fundamentally worry about that fat tail risk? The answer is no. 2 more points before I open to questions, because it's hard to do the world in 20 minutes. When I look at China, the fundamental challenge for the United States, very similar to the fundamental challenge for a country like Germany, is that even if you only focus on the economic issues and you leave security behind, you leave North Korea and the Middle East and the South China Sea and the East China Sea, you are in an environment where the ability of American multinationals to effectively compete against Chinese state-owned enterprises is being undermined. And it's being undermined in part because the Chinese will continue to double down on state fixed investment and their entrenched SOEs as long as they do not fundamentally believe that the West is going to be able to outtake them through continued sustained growth. The consensus view in China is to be cautious and bearish about the United States, Europe, and Japan. It is to want to decouple the Chinese economy from as much interdependence as they have had historically on the dollar, as they have had historically on exports to those countries. And that means doubling down on the state. Furthermore, the willingness of the Chinese government to go after these entrenched interests, who clearly benefit from continuing to control cheap capital and its allocation, is very low indeed. We've seen this with Xi Jinping. When it's seen to be a political threat, they don't deal. People complain, we don't know where he is. The Chinese view is, we do not owe it to you to explain it. We have to create growth, we have to maintain jobs. Despite the relative Chinese slowdown, unemployment has not become a disastrous issue. From Beijing's perspective, that is all we need to do. We do not need to explain to you the problems we have within our government. Having said that, they are trying to run a 21st century economy with a 20th century authoritarian political system. Over time, those challenges will exacerbate. The impact of that for a country like Japan will grow dramatically. In 5 years' time, we will look back and we will say that the events of the last week have much more impact on the Japanese economy than the events of Fukushima in 3/11. Without any question. The Japanese are going to have a real hard time operating economically with large Chinese exposures over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. The U.S. can take advantage of that because they have nowhere else to go, but it's going to be a real challenge for Japan. Final point, Middle East, I'm going to end on a down note. And that is that the big problem in the Middle East, the winners in the last week, Bashar Assad's a winner. 18 months, 20,000 dead, over 200 dead a day going forward, and the ability or the willingness of the United States to intervene given what's happened last week has gone down. The willingness of the Russians to dig their heels in and say, we said no on Libya, and look what happened, only reluctantly, and look how bad, we're not countenancing this on Syria. It benefits the Iranians, which of course will make the Israelis more shrill. Makes it harder to engage tough sanctions against Iran, makes it harder to push them. Other things on our plate. Actually, it makes it easier for the Israelis on the Palestinian issue. How much pressure will the Israelis have internationally to stop doing settlements, for example, in the West Bank? And the answer is not. Now, in lots of parts of the world, the relative absence of international players is not a disaster. Brazil, Some people say Brazil has benefited from benign neglect from the United States for a long term. I don't think that's true, but it hasn't been hurt dramatically. Latin America, generally speaking, has been immune from a lot of the geopolitical challenges and creative destruction the world has seen. The Middle East, that will not be true in a very, very clear way. Because when the United States, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians are absent from the Middle East, the countries that matter are countries that fundamentally disagree with each other about outcomes. Turkey versus Iran gets much more tense. That's a problem, not only from a military perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because of the extraordinary growth in trade ties between the two countries, the importance in infrastructure development, the importance in energy, all of that. What the Egyptians want in the Middle East, what the Qataris want, what the Saudis want, what the Iranians want, what the Turks want, these are not in any way going to be mutually compatible. And you will see proxy wars as a consequence. And the impact of that for the Middle East as a region to develop economically will, on balance, be negative. That is a much bigger problem for the Europeans, who rely on the Middle East more for trade and for energy than the United States, which of course is part of the problem. If Syria falls apart, it's not great for the US, but we can deal. Afghanistan falls apart, same thing. Much bigger problem for Pakistan. And that is the nature of a lot of these conflicts as we see them start to emerge. So again, what am I saying in terms of general environment for your corporations? Trade environment will continue to see more integration, but largely coalitions of the willing. Will be more regional, will be more like-minded, will be less efficient. The United States will look comparatively attractive in this environment, though we'll have the capacity to continue to push off difficult decisions for a longer period of time, which will upset some of our sensibilities. The Europeans will not fall apart, nor will they grow. Political tensions will grow over the long term, but economic integration will be facilitated. Germany will be far more important. Japanese will be in a lot of trouble in this environment. A lot of other countries in Asia will be able to more effectively continue to balance between China and the United States. Countries like Indonesia, Australia, for example. India, in particular, will be very effective at balancing between the US and China. And to end with at least a really positive point, Sub-Saharan Africa across the board, a very big winner in this environment. 1.1 billion in Sub-Saharan Africa, just like in India. But they spend more money on goods and services than the Indians do. They've got higher urbanization rates than the Indians do. The trajectory is much stronger. Year-on-year consumption growth is much stronger. It's not just that the Chinese get to own all of Africa. Everyone wants to play. As a consequence, the Africans can actually allow these folks to compete against each other. The Africans end up winning. Not all of them, not every country, but on balance, governance across the board is improving dramatically. Education improves, demographics become more normalized, and our companies start paying more attention. That, with 1.1 billion people in the world, is a very positive development indeed. So that's 20 minutes. I'm told I get at least 10 more to answer questions, and I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much.